This is a paid message from White Boy, Black Girl, a new book from Adaisy and Chad Brinkman. White Boy, Black Girl is an open-handed invitation from Adaisy and Chad to learn what our differences can teach us, one honest conversation at a time. Their honest back and forth throughout the book gives us common, usable language to meet each other where we're at. Let the awkward conversations begin. For more information, go to Tyndale.com.
So I moved here in August of 2007, took over the job. Again, remember, huge moral failure. Front page of every newspaper, scandal, embarrassment. A lot of brokenness when I got here in August of 2007. People didn't trust me. They had every reason not to trust me. Their last pastor had failed them. And here I am, the stepdad, showing up, trying to bring health and vitality to a church that's broken. So that's in August, okay? On my 100th day as senior pastor at New Life Church, December, fast forward 100 days, December the 9th, 2007, a gunman came on my campus with 1,000 rounds of ammunition, an automatic assault rifle, killed 2 teenage girls in my parking lot, came into my children's hallway and opened fire.
This is Where You're From, an origin story podcast at the intersection of faith and culture that digs into the influences and experiences that shape who we are today. Join us as we gain insight into the Bible's wisdom for all, regardless of where we're from. Hey y'all, this is Rasul Berry. Thanks for joining me on Where You're From. This week, I want to share my conversation with Pastor Brady Boyd. Brady is the author of numerous books and the pastor of New Life Church, a multicultural and multi-site church in Colorado Springs. Brady has a heart for those on the edges of society and breaking down the walls that divide the church. You can find out more about Pastor Brady Boyd by clicking on the links in the show notes or by visiting whereyou'refrom.org. That's whereyafrom.org. Please join me as I ask Brady Boyd, where you're from.
I am from a small town in northwest Louisiana called Logansport. It's right on the Sabine River that separates Texas from Louisiana. A fun fact about my hometown is it was a known hideout for criminals back in the 19th century. So criminals who were in Texas, if they could get across the Sabine River into Louisiana, the Texas Rangers would not pursue them past that border. And so my hometown became kind of a known hangout for criminals. In fact, okay, this is a sobering story, but my great-great-grandfather was in Tennessee. He murdered a federal agent who discovered his still. He packed up his family and got them to Logansport because he knew if he got to my hometown, law enforcement would not follow him there. So that's my family history. Wow. Growing up in a very rough and tumble place called Logansport, Louisiana. And every time I drive in there, you can feel it. Like, this is a rough spot. Okay. And really good people there, but it has a notorious history for sure. Got you.
And how did that notorious history inform you as a kid and some of the things you got involved in?
Well, I grew up in a wild environment. I mean, if you think about Tom Sawyer, that's kind of the way I grew up. I grew up in a very rural area. I had a horse, a hatchet, and a gun at 8 years old.
Wow.
And my mom and dad would just turn me loose. I mean, I was wild and free. My parents let me roam the woods and hundreds of acres, really, to just go explore. And my brother and I would get on our horses and be out in the woods, building stuff, burning stuff. We had chickens, we had a garden, we had cattle and pigs. And I try to just tell people about my childhood, and it's almost like a movie. People that grew up in the big city, they don't understand rural America and the way it used to be 40, 50 years ago. And so there was a lot of challenges there as well. I mean, obviously, the Deep South had its problems with racism and segregation. My first grade class was the second class in my county that integrated. So I felt that as a young man growing up in the segregated South. A lot to overcome growing up, trying to understand the world in a better way. But I also saw my childhood as something that prepared me for pastoral ministry because it gave me a sense of risk, a sense of adventure. I'm not afraid to take risk right now. I'm not afraid to fail. And I think a lot of that is because I grew up in an environment that was encouraged. Be bold, be adventurous. My dad and my mom allowed me to really explore life and make mistakes and not be punished for it. So I'm grateful for that.
As a native Philadelphian, that does sound like a whole nother world of experience, but sounds like fun too. So one of the things that you've said that you've heard a lot growing up was he had it coming. Tell us about what that phrase may have meant and how it may be emblematic of some of the cultural dynamics of, where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in an environment where people solved their disputes physically a lot of times. So I grew up in those environments. I had a brother that's almost 2 years younger than me. So, we would wrestle and tussle and punch each other, but nobody else could punch him but me. I could. And, just growing up in an environment where there's a lot of bullying. I mean, today I'm grateful that the school systems today are more aware of bullying and have taken some proactive steps to help kids overcome. But when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, bullying was a part of the school culture. And my senior year in high school, I was 135 pounds. So I was very small, kind of fragile growing up. I was a heart patient from birth. So I've had chronic heart issues my entire life. So I never was strong. I was never the biggest kid, the toughest kid. So I had to learn how to defend myself and fight off people sometimes. And I'm grateful my kids did not experience that in their public school settings. But it was a different world back in the 70s and 80s. And part of that shaped me. Now I don't have any tolerance for bullying. I don't like political bullying. I don't like social bullying. I have zero tolerance for it now. And it's really shaped the way I preach, the way I lead, the way I build teams. We're there to make sure the environment is safe and healthy and protective of people, where I feel like I have a tenderness toward those who have been marginalized. When I look into my own city, my own county, and I see people that have been pushed to the margins, they don't have an opportunity to succeed. I have a compassion for them. And I think it was built into my own experience where I was the one that was marginalized. I was the one that was targeted. And so I have empathy for people now that find themselves on the margins.
I appreciate you sharing that. And when you think about that past and that history of being the one that was marginalized or bullied, give us an example, like paint us a picture of what that looked like in your own life growing up.
Well, again, I was born with a heart condition called tetralogy of Fallot, which is fatal back in 1967. But by a series of miraculous acts, I found myself in a hospital in Houston at 6 months old, and a very famous heart surgeon named Denton Cooley saved my life. In fact, the day that he did my surgery, he did 8 surgeries that day, 8 kids, 6 of those kids died in surgery, and me and a girl from Romania were the only 2 that survived surgery that day. So I grew up knowing I was living on borrowed time. And by the age of 4 years old, I'd already had 2 open heart surgeries. And this is, again, 1971, 72, where that technology was awful. I mean, most kids did not survive heart surgeries in the 1970s. And by the grace of the Lord, I did. But in my junior high years, my early high school years, I was very small. I was 120 pounds and a lot of bullying. And I was different than a lot of kids. I felt like the Lord gave me a curious mind and a heart. And so I was reading books that my friends weren't reading. And I always felt like an outsider. I'm reading college level books in the 5th grade. And my friends are, looking at Sports Illustrated, and I just didn't have a lot in common with them at times. And it really put me in the crosshairs of bullies. I remember, in the 7th grade, just being bullied and punched and really physically abused. And I had to tell my parents at some point about it. My dad had to intervene at the school. Thank God that we didn't have social media back in my day. I mean, I don't know if I would have survived those threatening times with that much pressure on me. And today's kids are facing a different set of pressures that I just have a lot of empathy for them right now.
Man, that is so true. And I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that you were like the second class that experienced that integration. And when you think about your own experience, what were some of the early remembrances you had of the racial dynamic and what was going on in that type of bullying you were seeing?
Well, I was very aware of it because in my little small town, there was the school where the black kids went and the school where the white kids went. And I knew that school. And I didn't understand it as a child, but I knew it was wrong. And I knew there was something broken with that. And 2 years before I started 1st grade, they shut down the school where the black kids went and integrated them into the school where the white kids went. I mean, when you're 7 or 8 years old, you don't have the full understanding of it. But I'll tell you what broke me free from some of the cultural dynamics. My wife and I, when we were newly married couple, we were 22, 23 years old. We lived in a town called Shreveport, Louisiana. And in 1992, it was the most violent per capita. East St. Louis and Shreveport, Louisiana were the two most violent cities in America at the time. And my wife and I, we were a part of a church that had a mixed race pastor. He's the one that helped me see things better and helped me have a better worldview. He had grown up in a Black experience. He understood the dynamics of racism in the Deep South in a way that I didn't. And so he told me, he said, Brady, the only way we can break this cycle of racism is for us to get to know people and to have relationships with people that are not like us. And so there were 20 houses on Abbey Street in a very violent neighborhood. And for 4 years, every Saturday for 4 years, we went down there probably 175 times in 4 years. On Saturday morning, we would show up at 9 a.m. We would knock on all 20 doors, introduce ourselves, and just ask them, hey, how can we pray for you? We're in the neighborhood. What can we do to help? So we became dear friends with 20 families on Abbey Street. Many of them were elderly people who were shut-ins. Mr. and Mrs. White became dear friends to us. They were an elderly Black couple. He was a deacon at his Kojic church there in the neighborhood. And in fact, when he passed away, I spoke at his funeral. I was the only white pastor that got to speak at his funeral. And we just fell in love with the people on Abbey Street. And I think for Pam and I, my wife, in our early 20s, that was the deciding factor where we saw humanity. We listened to their story. We listened to their history. It opened our eyes to what was going on in the Deep South at that time. And those 4 years have shaped a lot of my ministry philosophies going forward. It's helped me be more empathetic. In fact, the book I'm writing with Our Daily Bread is dedicated to Mr. and Mrs. White. If you look inside the front cover of the book of Life Minded, it says, I dedicate this book to Mr. and Mrs. White, who showed me love when I didn't know how to love. They were formative in my life at an early age.
And that's such a beautiful story. And to kind of circle back, because you talked about this sense of ministry, what is your faith journey and how did that connect with your parents and just like your growing up years?
Well, I grew up in a very Pentecostal, charismatic home. My mom was a fireball preacher, prayer. My dad didn't come to Christ until after I left the home, so I didn't grow up with a father who was a believer. But my mom, man, she made up a difference. She was a praying machine. So she prayed me into the kingdom. I was in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and any other night that they were having church. My mom required us to go to church, and I'm grateful for that. So I grew up in a very Pentecostal, Assemblies of God, kind of charismatic home in the Deep South. And Eugene Peterson, I got to spend some time with him later in his life, and he said, Brady, growing up as a charismatic, that's a great way to grow up because you think everything in the Bible is possible. Like when you read something in the Bible, people being raised from the dead, the sick being healed. As a kid, it's great to learn that maybe that could happen today, right? And then as you grow older, he said, it's very important that you put down deeper roots and to understand the history of your faith, the creeds, the sacraments. And that's really been my journey. So I started out very charismatic Pentecostal, but I've been on this journey for the last 15 years to really understand the historical roots. And so if you look at me today, you would say, yes, he's charismatic in his theology, but he's historical in his practices.
That's nice. So, you mentioned going to church quite a bit, that old school Pentecostal tradition, especially on Sunday. You got like a couple services, meal in between, right? But when you go off to college, oftentimes that's where it becomes a test of like, what do I really believe and what's just what I've been raised in? What was your experience like when you think about high school to college and how did that impact your faith journey?
I definitely went through a period of rebellion and searching and seeking and really walked away from my faith probably at 17 years old and spent a lot of my college years, like a lot of college kids, exploring and trying to figure out what I could own and what I didn't want to own, And it was really my senior year of college where I came to Christ, where I really decided to follow Christ. But for the first 3 years of college, it was a lot of rebellion, just a lot of being a knucklehead, quite honestly. And I did find the Lord in my senior year of college.
So when you think back, because you talked about being bullied, when you think about what college meant for you to I could imagine it could have been an escape from kind of what you were experiencing. How did you think about college and how did that maybe even inform where you decided to study and go?
Well, I'm the first person on either side of my family to graduate college, so it was a brand new experience for me. I didn't have anyone to point the way for me, and I qualified for college. I got accepted into Louisiana Tech University, and it was a whole new world for me. It was a world that I had only imagined existed. I didn't really understand it, but I have some great professors. I had an English professor that spent a lot of time with me. I had a journalism professor that spent a lot of time with me. I fell in love with my professors. I saw something in their life, their intellectual life, their academic life that I'd never experienced before. I'd never been around academic people that took their learning and studying seriously. And it awakened something in me. I mean, I began to read Shakespeare. I began to read English literature. I began to study the great minds. I ended up with a journalism degree, but I spent a lot of my passion with English literature and actually became the sports editor for my college newspaper. And so writing and words and crafting language became very important for me. I just fell in love with the whole process of telling a story. And I think that helped shape me as a pastor.
Yeah, that's cool. So you're there, you're experiencing this academic environment that is breathing new life into your mind. You are experiencing this great sports culture and seeing that thrive and your place in it as a journalist. And you're living how you want to live, indulging every desire that you may have had and no longer being forced to go to church every day. This doesn't necessarily seem like a moment that would necessarily lend itself to reflection and repentance and all of these things. So what were the circumstances in the midst of all this like enthusiasm and excitement and all things going well that caused you to have this moment of faith?
Well, I do go back to my mom. I think prayer is the catalytic activity that causes people to come to Christ. I mean, if you got a mama praying for you, if you have somebody praying for you, at some point you're going to have to surrender. I mean, game over, right? And so my mom prayed me into the kingdom, and I knew that my life was headed to a place that I wasn't going. It was not going to flourish, and I saw that. Of all the good things I was experiencing, I also saw a path that I was walking down that I didn't see it ending well for me. And I didn't want to become that man. I didn't want to become that person. It wasn't shame. It wasn't guilt, but it was conviction. And it's a big difference between conviction and shame. I felt that my life had more meaning than it was having at the moment. A lot of superficial things were happening for me. I felt a lot of excitement, a lot of happiness, but it was emptiness as well. And I made a deal with God. I said, I'll do anything for you, but please don't make me be a pastor. I'll be a lawyer. I'll be a journalist. I want to bring justice to the world. I knew that my life, my path would be a path that would bring justice, that would help the marginalized. And I felt I could do that as a journalist. I could do that maybe as a lawyer. I thought about law school, but I didn't want to be a pastor. And the reason I didn't want to be a pastor is I'd never met anyone who was a pastor that I really admired. I grew up in small churches where the pastors were always poor and they didn't seem very happy, and they lived in a crappy house next to the church that nobody else would live in. And I thought, why in the world would you choose that as a profession? So I said to God, hey, I'll do anything for you. I'll charge hell with a water pistol, but I don't want to be a pastor. And of course, you got to be careful about saying that because that's exactly what it ended up being. My first job as a pastor, it was in a tiny church in a small town, and I lived in a parsonage. And I thought, I should have never said something to God about that. I should have just let this play out a different way. But I ended up pastoring a little tiny church, living in a parsonage at 29 years old. Wow.
Now, when does Pam come into your life?
I met her my freshman year of college, and we dated throughout our college years. And I met her in church. She was there to meet another guy, but I was sitting behind her, and the other guy didn't measure up to her standards, and I was there on the rebound. And so one night after church, I said to her, hey, you want to grab some pizza? And in June of 1986, we went to Snuffy's Pizza in Arcadia, Louisiana, had pizza together on a Sunday night, and I got her phone number. And the next weekend, I took her out, and she's been my girlfriend now for 38 years. Ever since that time, we've been married almost 35 years.
Wow!
But she's a delight. I mean, she's my best friend. Marriage is a joy, and it's gloriously difficult work. But marriage is something that is a gift from the Lord. For me, Pam is an amazing mom. She's a great friend. She's hilarious. She still makes my heart leap when I'm around her. I'm grateful for the gift of Pam in my life.
That's beautiful and well said. And one of the things that I find interesting when you have somewhat of a public ministry is that oftentimes people are not privy to all the ways that your spouse and your partner have contributed to what they get to experience if you are. So I tell people when I preach, like anything that you've heard from me that has been beneficial to you, you have to also thank my wife Tamika for, because she usually hears my messages or gives me feedback and all those things. So what kind of role did Pam have when you started down that path of ministry? What role did she have in your life?
Well, she's my most trusted critic, and she will tell me the truth, good or bad, and she holds me accountable. She is my sounding board. She is my biggest cheerleader. She's a confidant. Like, I can confide in her. I can share my deepest worries, fears, concerns with her. And that's a gift. Yeah. That's a joy. She carries a great amount of weight as the pastor's wife. She has a role at the church as well. She's a bona fide leader in her own right. She's smart. She's thoughtful. She's the most discerning person I've ever met. So I lean on her a lot to help me discern relationships and issues. She just sees things really clearly, really quickly. And that's a gift. That's wonderful. So when you take on this new role as a pastor in a small church in the parsonage, she's with you. She's with me. She's with you. And where is this parsonage? This is Hereford, Texas, which is just kind of north and west of Amarillo. The end of the earth is 2 miles outside of town. The flat earth drops off right there, right outside town. Listen, I don't know what that means. I know. I'm joking with you. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's 15,000 head of cattle. It was a big cattle town. And I'm telling you, the best people on the planet. We met some of the best people out there, but it was in the wild west of West Texas. And we're from Louisiana, so it was a cultural shock to us in some ways to be out there in the West. But it was a beautiful time. We had a couple of years there. The little church thrived and really went through a rebirth when we were there for the 2 years. And a lot of great memories. In fact, both of our children, we adopted both of our kids. And that happened when we were living in Amarillo, Texas, and Hereford, Texas. So my kids were born in Texas, and they're West Texans. That's quite now. So you graduate from Louisiana Tech, and then you don't go straight into ministry. What did you do in the meantime between graduation and then pastoring? Yeah, I had a very different route into ministry than traditionally. I didn't go to seminary. I don't have a Bible degree. I have 25 years of really thoughtful mentoring in my life. I have a college degree, and I'm a learner. I'm a reader. I'm a thinker. But I had to surround myself with heavyweight theologians to make up the gap that I didn't have in my own life. And I'm thankful the Lord has always had people around me that I could learn from. And so I know I'm prepared to preach. I know what I'm talking about. I have a theological understanding of the scriptures. But it didn't come through a seminary experience. It came through a relational experience. People that kind of crafted me and saw something in me that I really didn't see in myself. They put me on a path of learning that allowed me to grow as a pastor, as a preacher. So I was working in radio and television when a pastor just said, Brady, I just see something on you that's different. I want you to walk alongside me. I want you to read this with me. I want you to think about this along with me. And that was my experience for about 10 years. Wow. Where I just was around really good men and women who invested in me, who prepared me, who held me accountable for what I was reading and learning. And then I look up one day, I'm 28, 29 years old, and this little church in Hereford, Texas, asked me to be their senior pastor. And I said, look, I don't have a seminary degree, but I've been a lifelong learner. And so as serious as any seminary student took their learning, I took my learning as well. And even today, I'm 57 years old, and it surprises me, honestly, that I've had a 30-year career as a pastor without that formal training. And I encourage students to go to seminary. I am for the seminary experience. I believe in Bible school. I believe in formal training. It just wasn't the path the Lord had me on, and I've had to work hard to overcome that. That's good. So you alluded to this earlier, that this shift from Louisiana and what you had known to West Texas was quite a culture shift. Tell us a little bit about that difference in culture and even how that may have formed you as well. Well, I pastored a lot of years in Texas, and now I'm in Colorado, and there's a lot of self-independence in both those places. I mean, people in Texas, they call themselves the Republic of Texas for a reason. a lot of independence, a lot of don't tell me what to do, leave me alone. I can get this done on my own. And then I moved to Colorado, where that's still a big part of the culture here. Growing up in the South, there was a lot of interdependence among family members, among people. I found that Texas and Colorado were a bit difficult, different. Great people. I love the people in Colorado. I love the people in Texas. But, the kingdom of heaven is not an independent work. It's interdependent. It's built around community. It's built around trust. It's built around self-sacrifice. And sometimes those ideas don't translate well in the Western culture. And so I've had to really help people understand that our best days are not good enough. Your best strength is not strong enough. The smartest people on the planet fall short of the glory of the Lord. And when you say those things to people, it confronts a long-held belief that's somewhat idolatrous, in my opinion. And so I had to learn how to pastor that group of people. I had to learn how to confront long-held beliefs without insulting them and inviting them into something better than what they've imagined their lives being. And that's always the job of a pastor, right? I heard this the other day, that leading a church is the art of really disappointing people in a way they can accept. You're constantly confronting idols, right, out of the pulpit. And you're telling people that their idols are not enough. And you have to do that in a way that confronts them and challenges them without insulting them and kind of inviting them along on a journey that you're on as well.
Yes, so good. And it reminds me of a passage in 1 Corinthians where Corinth was, this main city in the Greco-Roman world, and they very much prided themselves off of their identity. And Paul says, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." And isn't that just interesting contrast that Paul is kind of offering them into? Like, instead of seeing your identity and your culture as just valuable because of its strength, there's actually this upside down kingdom that God has now engrafted us into, in which we actually are supposed to boast in our weaknesses, because that is when we are weak, he is strong. Is that something that you see as a message that has been kind of valuable for you to kind of instill in the places where you've ministered?
No doubt. Don't get me started on Corinth. I wrote a whole book on Corinth, and they were new money. They were a rebuilt city. They were the new wealth. They had power, and it was also a military town. A lot of military retirees lived in Corinth. A lot of Roman retired generals and soldiers had land around Corinth. It was a town built on a lot of pride and a lot of arrogance, quite honestly, and a lot of broken sexuality in Corinth. And I find that that's true about a lot of places in the United States. We're a lot of new wealth. We're a new country.
Yep.
I mean, we're less than 300 years old, and by world standards, we're pretty new.
Yeah.
And we're pretty prideful about that, some of the things we've accomplished as a young country. But it's also, we have to confront this idolatry that's inside of us, this pride, this arrogance, that we can do things without God. And I that's what I'm confronting every single day. Listen, we need Jesus. We need his kingdom. We need his power. We are not enough. And pastoring in Colorado is convincing people that Jesus is still enough. And we still need him.
When we come back, Pastor Brady Boyd will share how he accepted the call to lead a church through a scandal that made national news, only for it to be rocked even harder when a gunman walked through its doors. That's coming next on Where You're From.
Why do I love my wife so much I feel it's forever? Why have I had moments I think will last for all time? As you're an inquisitive Christian listening here, I have a podcast you'll like and grow with each episode, scene, and song. Yes, As I Recall Forever is a podcast musical, a first of its kind. I'm Bill Mullen, creator of As I Recall Forever. I serve adults in the authoring stage of life, questioning their situation and direction, writing their own original script, asking now, after some success and challenge, how can I go from ambition to realize greater purpose? Get perspective on your life stage, kicking back and listening to an enjoyable faith quest memoir that journeys into our innate belief in forever. As I Recall Forever. Discover it at asirecallforever.com.
Hey, y'all, before we get back to my conversation with Pastor Brady Boyd, I want to share a quick teaser from our next episode with Danielle Mark. This is Where You're From.
I had to actually work through, how do I respect God and respect his people at the same time? How do I navigate this? Because it's not the same freedom and it's not the same invitation to come fully. And that was tough. So I had to deal with being the only Black woman and Black person on my team for the first year. And I had never experienced anything like that in ministry. Then I had to navigate being what I thought at the time was the only Pentecostal woman. Everyone else was evangelical. I had to walk through being the only one with the knowledge to talk about racial issues. I was the first Black friend for most people on my team. Except for like one. And I was just like, I don't understand that. I've had white friends forever. How have you never had a Black friend? So like navigating all of those things were very new to me.
Now let's get back to our conversation with Pastor Brady Boyd on Where You're From. So you're there at this small church in Hereford, Texas. Things are great. You're enjoying things, but you don't stay there. So what's the next chapter and why?
Well, there was a young pastor at the time named Robert Morris, came through town. He spoke for me, did 2 or 3 nights of preaching for me, and some people got saved, and it was amazing. And he took me to a restaurant on his way out of town. He said, Brady, I'm planting a church in Southlake, Texas. I think you and Pam are supposed to come help me plant this church. It took about a year, but in March of 2001, I packed up my family. I moved down to Southlake, Texas to help Gateway Church get off the ground. In my 6.5 years there, they grew from 50 to about 15,000.
Oh my God.
I mean, it was the most remarkable growth I've ever experienced. It almost killed me. I tell pastors all the time, when you pray for success, you better pray for rest, because success will kill you as much as failure will.
Wow.
And we grew at an unbelievable pace. I became the associate senior pastor of the church. All I did was hire people and start small groups and build things and set up systems and processes to try to manage the growth that was happening. That was really supernatural growth. I mean, it was unbelievable.
And what do you attribute that to? Because, I mean, you said from 50 to 15,000 in
15,000
in 6.5 years?
I'm not exaggerating that.
How?
It was crazy.
How?
I don't know. I think Dallas-Fort Worth, number one, it's a large city, several million people. And I think at the time, Gateway Church found a niche. There was a lot of churches in Dallas-Fort Worth that were kind of seeker-friendly, that were a lot of people who were getting saved, but we focused on discipleship and living life with the Holy Spirit. And I think people were hungry for discipleship, growing deeper in their walk with the Lord. So our church, we just got flooded with people who were hungry for those things.
Okay, so you're part of this amazing experience. You're seeing this, exponential growth happening. So what happens next?
Well, I'm in a supportive role, and I tell young leaders all the time that if you can't support another person's vision, then you'll never be able to build a team around your own vision. And I felt those 6.5 years were really a crash course on how to serve someone else and how to be a supportive person to another man's vision. And in August of 2007, I was feeling this huge stirring in my heart to be a senior pastor. I couldn't shake it. I tried to die to it. I tried to give it away, but the Lord kept bringing it back to me. And that's when I became senior pastor of New Life Church in Colorado Springs. I was 40 years old. Gateway prayed over me. They sent me out with their blessing. They were proud of me. I'm grateful for that. I didn't leave in a bad way. I left as a submitted son. There is a joy and a blessing that comes with that.
Now, the word New Life Church in Colorado Springs, that, is something that many of us are familiar with. It was also a very big church that had expanded very fast. And this was not without its own controversy of what you were walking into. So kind of paint a picture of what it meant to take on this role, which was a pretty highly public and publicized transition.
It was. So in November of 2006, there was a scandal that was on the front page of every newspaper. It was the lead story of every broadcaster around the world a very famous pastor, Ted Haggard, had a very public moral failure in November of 2006. And actually, I was still in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I remember waking up on that Friday morning, opening up my laptop, and there it was. There was a story. And it wasn't the first time I had heard a story of a famous pastor having a moral failure, but something happened in me that day. I cried. I had tears and run down my face, and I didn't know why. I went and woke my wife up. It was very early in the morning. I said, Pam, I don't know what's going on. I'd never been to New Life Church. I'd never been on the campus. I'd never met Ted Haggard. I said, but what's going on? My heart's broken over this. And I look back now and I realize the Lord was preparing me to become the next senior pastor. So that was November of 2006. In May of 2007, I sent my resume to the search team, really because a mentor of mine told me to. I didn't want to do it. I didn't even want to apply for the job, but a mentor said, Brady, send your resume. And so I did. And to my surprise, they called me and said, hey, we got your resume. We've made a decision. You're one of the 10 finalists. I said, oh, great. I can put that on my resume that I made the finalist. And then about a month later, they called me and said, hey, you're one of the final 4. I said, really? And they said, we want you to come to Colorado and apply for the job. Come interview with us. So on Mother's Day weekend of 2007, my wife and I flew up here to Colorado Springs, and we interviewed for like 2 days. And on the last day, before we're getting on a plane to come back to Dallas-Fort Worth, I'm in a hotel room, and I open up the book of Nehemiah, and the Lord said, I want you to read the whole book. So I had read Nehemiah. I knew the story, broken down city walls. He weeps and cries. He comes and rebuilds the city. But he said, that's what you're going to do at New Life Church. This is a once great church, but its walls have been devastated by scandal. But you're going to come, and I'm going to give you the same strength that I gave Nehemiah, and you're going to come and rebuild this. But with my help, we're going to rebuild New Life Church, and I want you to say yes to this assignment. That was in May. In August, they called me and said, you're the new senior pastor of New Life Church.
Wow.
So I moved here in August of 2007, took over the job. Again, remember, huge moral failure. Front page of every newspaper, scandal, embarrassment. A lot of brokenness when I got here in August of 2007. People didn't trust me. They had every reason not to trust me. Their last pastor had failed them. And here I am, the stepdad, showing up, trying to bring health and vitality to a church that's broken. So that's in August, okay? On my 100th day as senior pastor at New Life Church, December, fast forward 100 days, December the 9th, 2007, a gunman came on my campus with 1,000 rounds of ammunition, an automatic assault rifle, killed 2 teenage girls in my parking lot, came into my children's hallway and opened fire. A very heroic security guard met him and confronted him in my children's hallway, wounded him. He crawled into an adjacent space and blew the top of his head off in my children's hallway. That's day 100 of my tenure as senior pastor at New Life Church. So I want you to think about this. In 13 months, New Life Church was on the front page of every newspaper, the lead story of every broadcast, one for a scandal, 13 months later for violence that came into our church. I'm thinking, here I am. I have moved my family to Colorado Springs. I've been the senior pastor for 100 days. I've just started the healing process for the scandal. And now here I am having to lead my church through the devastation of gun violence that's come on my campus. I thought to myself, well, maybe this is why I've been called to New Life Church. Maybe I'm just a hospice pastor. Maybe I'm here to give a once great church a great funeral, a great burial. Because at the time, quite honestly, there was no hope at all in my mind or heart that New Life could recover from those two things in a 13-month window.
Wow. Okay. So much to unpack there. But
we may need another podcast.
Yeah. I'll just kind of ask, because the thing that struck me as you've talked about this and written about this is the despair in the congregation and them even saying things like this should just be a used car parking lot. And to imagine people who have committed to a faith community and believed that this was what God had led them to be a part of, to then have that kind of, perspective about the place that they're at, that just kind of speaks to a type of despair that is hard to wrap your head around. So just tell me a little bit about that. What was it like that you were seeing and hearing and feeling as you walked through those halls, especially on the back end of such a tragedy?
Well, I honestly I was very hopeless. I mean, it was the darkest day of my life. And I thought to myself, I don't know how we can move forward. We were paralyzed. I mean, we were paralyzed by scandal. Now we're paralyzed by violence. I thought to myself, I don't know how this is going to happen. But here's what we did. I thought, okay, I can't wait until next Sunday to meet with my people. So I called for a prayer meeting that Wednesday night. And I thought, nobody's going to show up. But to my surprise, 6,000 people showed up to that prayer meeting. And the room is packed. It's a 5,000-seat auditorium. I had 6,000 people in that auditorium. And we began to worship and pray. And I thought, I don't have a tricky sermon. I don't have some genius leadership strategy to lead us out of this. What I do have are the Psalms. I have those Psalms of lament and Psalms of hope that I can read over my church. So that night I read Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then I read all of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. And then I read Psalm 91, under the shadow of his wings. I just began to read Psalm 51, Lord, create in us a clean heart, O Lord. Renew in us a right spirit, O God. I began to read those Psalms over our church. And then we began to worship and pray together. We began to sing this song called Overcome. It was written at New Life Church during the scandal, but we began to sing it that night at that prayer meeting. And I'll tell you what happened. A holy defiance came into the room. I thought, okay, wait, my people are not going to back down. My people have some faith in them that I didn't realize. They have courage in them that honestly surprised me. And I got up and I said to my church, we will not be governed by fear. We're not going to be defeated by the forces of darkness that hate our church. And we're going to rally together. We're going to love each other sincerely. We're going to pray. And I wish I could say 2 weeks later, we had this revival and everything went back to normal. It didn't. It took 3 or 4 years for our church to recover from that, maybe even 5 years. But we were faithful to one another. We stayed steady. We didn't quit. We didn't run. And a revival and a resurrection story began to emerge out of New Life Church. I'll look back on this part of my life and I'll say, the church is more resilient than we think. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. That's what Jesus said about the church is true, that we can overcome anything if we will stay faithful and stay steady and believe him and trust him. And I know that sounds like, pithy church advice, but honestly, it's true.
I mean, one of those situations and crises could have been enough to shutter the doors. 2 within a 13-month span, that is just a remarkable story of endurance. And I think worthy of the name New Life, the resurrection life that you talked about. And in the context of that resurrection life, one of the other things that seemed to also emerge in a new way is a cross-cultural flavor and emphasis to New Life that even is now multilingual. Tell us a little bit about the journey that you've gone on with that and some of what God has done and even broken new ground at the church as it relates to that.
We have multiple congregations meeting across town speaking 3 different languages. We have a Mandarin-speaking congregation, we have a Spanish-speaking congregation, and then we have English-speaking congregations. But we have felt all along when we came to Colorado that we were here to build bridges, that we were here to see Black, white, and brown people worship together, young and old, rich and poor, men and women. That's the kingdom of heaven, right? I mean, that's the Revelation description of heaven, every tongue, every tribe, every language. When we get to heaven, we don't have to give up our cultural distinctions. We get to celebrate them. And I think that's the key for us is we're not asking people to give up their cultural distinctions. We're actually trying to encourage people to celebrate the distinctions of different people in our church. And I'm grateful. Our church has embraced it. We merged with a Spanish-speaking congregation 6 years ago. They were about 150 people at the time. This past Easter, they had 2,300 people with 30 different Spanish-speaking nations represented.
Wow.
They have exploded. They are amazing. A lot of undocumented people are finding their way into America. And I know the borders issue right now, it's very difficult, and I think it's broken. It's a system that needs to be repaired. But what is the church's response? Well, we're going to give them a place of safety. We're going to provide food for them. We're going to love them. And until our politicians and until people smarter than me figure out how to regulate and help this situation, the church's response is to love and to care and to serve. And a lot of these families are Jesus lovers. I mean, they are They're very godly people that found themselves in dire situations in Central and South America, and their only hope is to get into a place of safety for their family. And so we have tried to respond well, biblically, to these families. Our Mandarin-speaking congregation has been around for over 20 years, and they're the sweetest group of people. They speak Mandarin. They have very traditional Asian culture, but they love Jesus, and they're prayerful. I mean, they pray the paint off the wall every time they gather, and just, I love them, and I'm grateful that we get to be a part of them.
Man, you are like all in the Our Daily Bread ministry strategies that we have for partnerships. We have a Chinese ministry and Hispanic ministry. So if you don't know, we got translation content available in both of those. But I'm glad that you brought up some of these, cultural moments. And it seems like God always just tends to have you in the midst of a tipping point of a cultural moment. Have you noticed that in your life?
Well, I didn't ask for it. I know that. And it comes with all kinds of landmines.
Yeah.
I want to be a friend. I want to be a representative voice. I want to build bridges, and we're burning bridges right now in America, and that's not helping us. So I think what I can add is I can listen, I can try to understand, I can try to come alongside, I can try to be a friend, and that's really the mission of our church.
In your book, Life Minded, you refer to this as the multiplication of division, and you really look at and reflect how polarizing our times are. That even as a pastor, you wrote that families left because they couldn't believe I reopened the church after only 10 weeks. Some left because they couldn't believe that you shut the church down for 10 weeks. Some families left because you refused to support a Republican, candidate, a Democratic candidate. You didn't tell people to get a vaccine, didn't tell people not to get it. I mean, it's just like this list of things. So talk to us, pastor us. What is happening in our culture that you refer to as an outrage culture? And how do we get past it? How do we get beyond it?
Well, Ephesians says that the Holy Spirit is found when there's a unity of the Spirit and a bond of peace. And I feel like that right now we're at a tipping point in American culture where we have to decide, are we going to be Great Commandment and Great Commission people, or are we going to come up with our own solutions to the problems? Because Jesus told us what to do. And Jesus gave us a prescription. Listen, I am concerned about every cultural issue that we're talking about. I mean, so if you want to talk about gender, if you want to talk about race, if you want to talk about economic disparity, listen, I'm as concerned about all those things, and I think they're real problems. Right. I think our political environment is a mess. I don't have any hope or trust that government can solve any of our deepest problems. So what is the church's role? Well, the church's role is to get back to our assignment, to get back to our mission. And that is to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, to love our neighbors, ourselves, and to go into all the world and make disciples, baptize them, teach them what Jesus said. The church that has done that for 2,000 years has thrived. The church that's drifted away from that mission over the years has found themselves in really brokenness and problems. I want to lead a church, and I want to be a part of a church that is following Jesus and his mission. And in 2016, when I began to see these cultural shifts happen, when I began to see the divisiveness, I told my church, we're going to be Great Commandment and Great Commission people. Even if it puts us in direct conflict with our family and friends, we are going to stay focused on the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. I am not going to deviate from that. I don't mind talking about cultural issues. I don't mind talking about any problem you want to talk about. I'll have a conversation with you, but it will be through the lens of the Great Commandment and the Great Commission.
And how have people responded, and even your own congregation responded to that approach?
Our church is bigger than it's ever been. We are growing in an exponential way. Listen, this past weekend, we baptized 419 people in a single weekend, which is an all-time record in the 39-year history of our church. We have never seen more baptisms, more salvations, more unity, more joy than I'm experiencing right now in the local church. I cannot be more encouraged by what's happening at New Life Church than what's happening right now. And have people left our church mad? Yes. Hundreds of people have left over the years because I would not entertain their biases out of the pulpit. I would not reflect their rage about cultural issues. I told people a long time ago, you don't yell at the darkness. You bring light to the darkness. Listen, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they are mighty for the pulling down of strongholds. People are not my enemy. I have never seen people as the enemy. Do I see evil in our culture? Yes, but evil has always been around.
Right.
I mean, evil showed up in the garden. In the most perfect paradise that's ever been created, evil showed up.
Yeah.
So why are we surprised about evil? Evil is evil, and we should call out evil when it's evil. But people are not our enemy.
I'm thinking about earlier, we talked about the bullying that you experienced and the way that it gave you a built-in resistance toward bullying across all the different aspects of division. How do you see that value inside of you as part of what causes you to respond to these cultural flashpoints as you do?
Well, I'm aware of the brokenness of humanity. I know what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be underestimated, to be dismissed. I have a tenderness toward that. I have a tenderness toward people who have not been parented well. Just this on Sunday, one of those 419 was a young girl. She's 22 years old. She's been going through all kinds of gender confusion. Her home life is a mess. She was in transition to becoming a male. She was wrestling with the very issues that we're seeing in our culture. So she showed up at our church about 6 months ago. She had started hormone therapy. She was going from female to male, but there was something inside of her that wanted to be a part of a church. She loved church. She had not given up on her faith, but she had given up on her gender. And so she was wrestling with all kinds of very complicated issues in her life. And we just loved her. We brought her in. We gave her a place of serving. We began to listen to her. She, about 3 months ago, came to us and said, I think I'm making a mistake. I want to be a woman again. I know that my life is a mess. I'm confused. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for not shunning me. Thank you for not being angry with me. So she now is in full, absolutely converting back to her original gender. She is thriving. You should see her face right now. I baptized her on Sunday, and she came up out of the waters. She's like, I was born a woman. I want to be a woman. I want to be a woman of God. I want to live my life in the way God designed me. Listen, that happened not because we were mad at her, angry at her, because I'm spewing some kind of vitriol at her. It's because I listened to her and our team listened to her and we cared for her. And the work of the Holy Spirit is what changed her life. Not my rhetoric and not my political opinions didn't change her life. It was the work of the Holy Spirit that rescued her. And I still believe, I know it sounds corny, right? But I still believe in the gospel. I think the gospel still changes people. I'm not going to give up on it. I'm going to stay focused on it. I know I'm going to upset people. I'm going to make people angry. But listen, we're all going to stand before the Lord one day and give an account for how we handle the message of Jesus. Were we faithful and true to preach the gospel in the context of our culture? I understand the complexities of our culture. I understand the nuances of our culture. But I still believe that for those of us who will stay steadfast and present Christ and talk about the beauty of the cross and the resurrection, his ascension, his soon return, there is a harvest of souls that are coming. That is coming. I'm seeing it right now. I am watching it happen at my church. An unprecedented harvest of salvation. Listen, 3 years ago, we were baptizing 100 people a year. We baptized 1,000 people in the last 13 months. Something is happening. Something is shifting. And I want to be a part of it. I want to see it happen. And I'm seeing it happen. And I just want to encourage pastors out there, don't give up on this. Stay true to the message of Jesus, and you'll see a harvest. You'll see the fruit of it in due time.
This is Where You're From. I'm Rasul Berry. And remember, it's not just about where you're at, it's also about where you're from. This show was produced by Ryan Clevenger and Mary Jo Clark. I also want to thank listeners Barry and Bobby for their help in supporting and promoting Where You're From. Thanks, y'all. Where You're From is part of the Voices collection from Our Daily Bread Ministries.